welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to be learning with you here again as part of Drish's Falls Man. This is the fourth of 8 sessions of Between Heaven and Earth, case studies of the tension between Halakha and morality with Rabbi Nathaniel Helfgot. Just some housekeeping first. As you come into the Zoom room, I will invite you to become a panelist. This just means that you can choose to put on your camera if you wish, so we can see your lovely faces. And that you will be able to unmute yourself when Rabbi Helfgot invites questions or comments. When you're not speaking, we just ask that you keep yourself on mute. Questions and comments are always welcome in the Zoom chat, or if you're joining us on Facebook Live, then in the Facebook comments. I'll be checking those as we learn. I'll put a link to the sources in the Zoom chat, and I'll also be sharing them on the screen. And with that, I will pass over to Rabbi Helfgot.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Good evening to everyone. Again, our thoughts and our hearts are in Israel and what's going on and everything that's going on. And we wish, only, Hashem should protect all the families, protect the hostages, and protect the soldiers, and anybody who is, caught in the crossfire who doesn't deserve to be injured or killed, God forbid, and that hopefully the hostages will return soon. And I just want to make one mention, housekeeping. As was mentioned, this is originally planned to be an 8-week session. I'm not sure exactly when, but I am going to be traveling to Israel. Obviously, was not attended on a mission, to solidarity mission with some other rabbis, as well as with to visit my son who's in Israel. It'll either be that the Monday of November 20th or the Monday of November 27th. We won't have class. It just depends on when my final flight. So you'll be informed. But next week, definitely class, but after that, we'll let everybody know exactly which one class we'll miss, and then it'll turn out to be a 7-week session. So that's going to be part of the unfortunate reality that we live with. Okay. So Erev Tov to everyone. Good evening to everybody. So last week in the 3rd session, we discussed the concept of halakha being a floor and not a ceiling, and we went into great depth discussing areas of halakha where clearly the notion was that this was, so to speak, right for its moral context in the history in which this mitzvah was given, but it was never seen as an ideal. It was never projected as an ideal. And we looked at things like slavery. We looked at things as things like Yifat Toar, Eshet Yifat Toar, the captive wife, and we looked at some other case studies, and that was the example of a floor and not a ceiling. Tonight we're going to go a little bit further, not in that, but we're going to actually examine 3 areas of halakha where you clearly get the sense, certainly from many significant rabbinic voices, that the moral intuitions that came to the fore impacted on interpretive moves within the halakha. And so this is already a different kind of interaction when halakha and ethics collide, in which the ethical moment, the ethical sense, pushes one to interpret or use certain techniques which are, pretty radical on their face, but because the conflicting demands of the notion of the Torah being an ethical book, Hashem being a good and just God, and other kind of moral principles that emerge from the Torah itself, as well as from our basic sense of morality, like there should be no vicarious punishment, that a person should be held responsible for their own actions and not be held responsible for the actions of others. How does that come into play with other halachic values? So that's what we're going to examine tonight. So let's look at the sources. If you could put the sources up on the screen. Okay, so we're going to start with the most famous example, or very well known, is ayin tachat ayin, the idea of an eye for an eye. Now, an eye for an eye is explicit in the Torah. Excuse me. The Bible, in discussing the very famous case, if two people are fighting and they hit a pregnant woman, which is of course a very important source text for the whole discussion about abortion and the fetus and the status of the fetus in Jewish law. V'yatzu yiladeha, and the children, the embryo comes out. V'lo yason, and the woman lives, she doesn't die. Anoshi hanei, she has to be punished. Kasher yashit alav bala isha v'natan biflili. The implication is that in this case, it's not considered a capital crime, which of course is very important for, as I said, for abortion. V'im ason, but if there was a terrible tragedy and the woman died, v'natata nefesh tachat nefesh, then the capital punishment is applicable. And then the Bible continues, seemingly in the same way, just as you take a life for a life, ayin tachat ayin, an eye for an eye, shein tachat shein, yad tachat yad, regel tachat regel. So an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, regel tachat regel, kviyah tachat kviyah, petza tachat petza, chabura tachat chabura. Now, on one level, this is actually a very moral concept. The concept of measure for measure, on a kind of abstract plane, certainly strikes us as something very ethical, tit for tat, or the word that's being thrown around right now, proportionality. You hurt my hand, so I hurt your hand. I don't kill you, which in some of the ancient Near Eastern texts, some of the ancient Near Eastern laws, if you hurt someone of a higher class, you might be liable for the death penalty, even if you just did damages and didn't kill the other person. So on some level, there's a certain ethical move here. On the other hand, of course, it feels, certainly to a Western ear, to a modern ear, as quote unquote barbaric, whatever you want to term. Now, the Bible itself already seems to hint that this should be taken not necessarily as an absolute, but as a kind of meta principle. So, for example, in Bamidbar, Perek Lamed Hey, in Numbers chapter 35, the Bible discusses murder on purpose, homicide, premeditated homicide, and as well as accidental homicide. And the Bible says, "V'lo tikchu kofer lenefesh rotzeach," you cannot take a ransom, asher hu rasha lamut, if he is guilty to be put to death, which was very common in the ancient world. The idea that a rich person could buy their way out of the punishment of capital punishment. So the Bible says, "V'lo tikchu kofer," you can't take a ransom, you can't take payment for the life of the murderer. Kimot yumat, he should be put to death by the capital punishment. V'lo tikchu kofer lanus el ir miklato, and you shall not take a ransom, lanus el ir miklato. You can't take a ransom for him to run away to a protected city. So there's a striking sense here. The Bible does not say that in any other context. The Bible does say, "V'lo tikchu kofer lenefesh rotzech." You cannot be bought off by money when it comes to capital crime. At least one possible inference from that is anything less than murder, anything less than the taking of a life, maybe there is room for kofer, for some sort of bimkom, some sort of in place of taking, here the Bible says absolutely, if you took a life on purpose, you have forfeited your life. The implication might be, when it comes to things which are less than murder, maybe there is room for some negotiation, for compensation instead of the other type. At least that's a possibility. And the Talmud very famously discussed this possibility, and in its back and forth, came to that conclusion. So the famous Gemara in Baba Kama on Daf Pei Gimel, in Tractate Baba Kama, on 83:1, Amai, or Ayin Tachat Ayin Amar Rachmana, Ema Ayin Mamash. Maybe it means literally an eye. So the Gemara says, Lo Salka Daitach, you can follow along in the English. The Tanya, it can't mean literally. So the Talmud goes into logical reasons why it can't literally mean Ayin Tachat Ayin. The Tanya, Yachol Simeyet Eino, Mesameyet Eino, Katat Yado, Mekatet Yado. Could be if somebody, would you think that if somebody gouged out the eye of somebody else, that you should gouge out his eye? Or if you cut off the hand of the other person, Shiberet Raglo, if you broke somebody's leg, Mishaberet Raglo, Talmud Lomar Makei Adam, Umakei Behema. The Bible sometimes juxtaposes the verse, especially, let's say, in the book of Vayikra in chapter 24, the Bible juxtaposes when you smite a man and when you smite an animal. The Bible the rabbis are willing to interpret and use that verse to reinterpret Ayin Tachat Ayin, not to be taken literally. Another source in that Gemara, exactly the inference I made before. V'imnavshecha lomar, hareyu omer lo tikchu kover lenevesh rotzeach asher l'shalom lenevesh rotzeach iyata lokeach kofer, aval lo teach kofer l'rashei varim shein chozrim. You can't take a ransom for the life of a murderer, but you can take a ransom for the life of another. You can take a ransom, for a hand or an eye, etc. So it's very clear the rabbis are consciously working towards making sure that we accept that the Ayin Tachat Ayin should be interpreted in that way. Now, one way to go with this is to say, look, the Talmud, the rabbis of the Talmud had a tradition, and that's certainly one way to take it, and certainly many traditional writers and readers and thinkers took it that way. The rabbis had a kind of Halakha l'Moshe Sinai. They kind of had an unbroken tradition going back to Sinai, that Ayin Tachat Ayin means mamon. That's one way to read it. And then you read all of the Talmudic back and forth to try to justify this interpretation as just kind of window dressing to satisfy kind of human curiosity, and to kind of satisfy that, look, you can even see hints to it in the biblical verses. That's one way to take it. Another way to take it, which is a more radical way to take it, is to say, no. This verse was kind of up in the air. When the rabbis read it, they didn't have an absolute tradition. In fact, we have evidence, Josephus and others mention that and as I said, in some of the ancient Near Eastern world, it was taken literally. And so one could at least raise, at least at this stage of the game, that no, the rabbis here were seriously, potentially at one point in history, entertaining the possibility that, yeah, in Hachanami, it may have meant literally, and they weren't sure how to apply it, and it was a kind of live discussion, a live option until they came to the conclusion based on logic, and possibly, even though the Talmud doesn't say it explicitly, possibly driven by some sort of aversion to the, to harming another human being, if there was another option, that given the fact that there is a possibility to read the biblical text, that Ayin Tachat Ayin is some sort of meta kind of principle, but the fact that the Bible at least hints to the possibility that you can use money as a substitute, let us then make sure that that substitute is always used because of some other principles. One could read it that way. Again, as I said, one could read this, if you want to use kind of our modern terminology, very frum. You could take this in a very frum way and say, Ayin Tachat Ayin, they had a Halakha l'Moshe Sinai, they had an unbroken tradition going back to Sinai, that it means mammon, that it means money. This is what God explained to Moses. And the entire back and forth in the Talmud is kind of a play, window dressing to try to justify for the human mind that you can even find a remez, you can find a hint for it in the biblical text. On the other hand, you could say, no, it was a live option. These were two live options. Given the fact that we know that historically there were cultures that actually put into play this, and maybe at one point it was the actual halacha did go in that direction. Maybe in some generations they did apply it literally. There is one Tana that is mentioned explicitly in the Gemara in Baba Kama, Rabbi Eliezer, who says Ayin Tachat Ayin Mamish. And if it's a reference to Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkinus, to the great Rabbi Eliezer Hagadol, we know that he often was reflective of a kind of ancient tradition. Maybe he's, to use the kind of academic term, that maybe he's reflective of the Halakha HaKeduma, the original Halakha before, the later generations decided that that wasn't the direction they wanted to go. Now, if we continue down, we'll see that when you start to get, to later generations and later commentaries, you see that the more, what we would say, moral or ethical qualms start to come to the fore, and the legitimacy of interpreting it literally is not just a technical, we found verses that allow for monetary, or at least hint to the fact that there can be monetary compensation, and therefore it's possible that's what the halacha means, but you find much more of a kind of in some sources, again, not all sources, again. So just to take 2 or 3 examples. So from the Middle Ages, the Ibn Ezra on Shemot Perek Chaf Aleph, on that verse, quotes Rav Saadia Gaon. Rav Saadia Gaon, the great Gaon of Fustat. Fustat is Cairo, old Cairo. Everyone's heard of the Geniza. So they found the Geniza in the old shul of Fustat, old Cairo, the old Jewish quarter of Cairo. Amar Rav Saadia. Rav Saadia says, Lo nuchal lefaresh pasuk kimashma'o. We cannot interpret this verse literally, because it raises a moral qualm. Ki im adam hike'ein chaveiro, v'sara shlishit or, if a person hits a fellow and blinds him, but he blinds him a third, he loses a third of his sight. How can you institute that you would now be entitled, or the court would now be entitled to inflict the same punishment on the other person? What does it mean, ayin tachat ayin? It may be that when you hit him, he's going to lose half of his sight, not a third of his sight. Ulay yachshich or eino kulo. Maybe you'll hit him so hard, he'll lose his entire sight. V'yoter kasha, and even more difficult, when the Bible says kiviyah tachat kiviyah, a burn for a burn, petza v'chabura, a strike and a wound and a blow for a blow. If the original blow was, let's say, to some place which is close to an internal organ, so the first person might have been lucky that it didn't cause bleeding in the internal organ. If you allow the person to hit the person in the same place, the other person, you might be off by 2 or 3 millimeters, and you might strike and cause internal hemorrhaging, which may cause someone to die. The ein hada'at sovelet, and logic does not can't tolerate such a system. Where is this comment from Rav Saadia Gaon from? So again, I'm not an expert in Rav Saadia Gaon, but I assume that if you looked in his commentary on the Bible, remember Rav Saadia Gaon wrote a commentary on the Bible, the tafsir, in Arabic, in Judeo-Arabic, which Ibn Ezra had access to, and you can find that discussion. But it's most famously known through the comment of Ibn Ezra. I have no reason to doubt that Ibn Ezra, and we have a commentary of Saadia Gaon on the Bible. There are excerpts. If you have the Torat Chaim edition of the Mikrot Lot, they have a thing called Perush Rav Saadia Gaon ala Torah, but it's a very excerpted work. Professor, I think his name was Moshe Zucker from the JTS, published a commentary of Rav Saadia Gaon, very long with a lot of footnotes on Bereshit, and I think there's you can get a whole entire commentary of Rav Saadia Gaon on the Torah. Again, I don't know if all of it has been translated into Hebrew or some of it is still in Judeo-Arabic, but this is the citation. Now, if we go further along in history, we go another 750 years, and we go, oh, you have it. You have Moshe Zucker's book. Good. So, okay. I know that it's on Bereshit. I don't know if he wrote on any other parts of the Torah. If we go about 750 years later, and we go to the Aruch HaShulchan, the Aruch HaShulchan is a book of Halakha that was authored by Rav Moshe Mordechai Epstein, who was the Rav in Nevardik. Nevardik is very famous. Anybody who ever read the writings of Chaim Grada, the great Yiddish writer. He wrote the Aguna and the Yeshiva and other books that have been translated. So in many of those works, he talks about the great Musar yeshivas that he encountered, and the Musar yeshivas that he encountered were in Nevardik. Nevardik as opposed to Slobodka. Slobodka is more famous to us for those who studied the Musar movement, but Nevardik. Now, Rav Moshe Mordechai Epstein wasn't a devotee of the Musar movement. He was a shtat rav. He was a rabbi in a city in Nevardik, and he wrote the Aruch HaShulchan. So Rav Moshe Mordechai Epstein writes as follows: V'Toratenu HaKadosha, at the end of Choshen Mishpat, when it discusses damages, so he throws in a little bit of hashkafa. He says, V'Toratenu HaKadosha derachea darchei noam. All of a sudden, you have here again, as I say, you see the kind of moral thrust coming to the fore. Toratenu HaKadosha derachea darchei noam. Our holy Torah, its ways are ways of pleasantness. Kigam min hachush, because simply by the chush, and again, I'm not sure what he means here as the feeling, or does he mean the senses? But he means something. It just kind of min hachush yesh echreach. It's it just from the kishkis. It's impossible that ayin tachat ayin, efshar liot mamash, can't be taken literally. Even though mamash, ain't no mamash. It can't literally be true. The yadua b'teva ha'adam, it is known, she'apachad ve'abe'ala mehatzar atid lavo kashe yoter mehatzar atzmo. Anxiety and fear and of an upcoming pain is much greater than the actual pain, often. And what he means to say is that if Reuven struck Shimon originally, Shimon wasn't intending to be struck, so it was out of the blue. So he just experienced the pain of being struck. But if Shimon comes back a few weeks later, and Reuven knows that the law is that he should be struck as punishment for striking, he's going to be full of worry and anxiety. V'nei Reuven, shenakar ayin shel Shimon vayazeh befeta pitom. This was just by accident, not by accident, but it was suddenly. V'lo yah l'Shimon mikodem pachad ube'ala. But now he is going to suffer great anxiety, a great pain, waiting for the punishment, thinking about the punishment. And so there's no equivalency. There's no way that there's ever equivalency. And so how could the Bible, if its ways are ways of peace and its ways are ways of pleasantness, it's impossible that there could be an exact midah keneged midah, because you're putting another person in a great state of anxiety, waiting to receive this punishment. And that itself is intolerable, and it's not an equivalence. If you continue, his son, who's also very famous, we know him as Rav Baruch Halevi Epstein, more famous as the Torah Tamima. He writes as follows: Listen to what he says. Even though it was possible to interpret the verses literally, meaning given the reality of the world and the world in which the Torah was given, and given the reality that that corporal punishment was given and put into place, it could have been so. It could have been that. B'chol zot, hichriu Chazal lismoch HaKabbalah da'kavana mamon. However, Chazal decided, hichriu, they made a conscious decision to, and again, this is a very, very interesting term, lismoch HaKabbalah, to support the tradition, which I hear mean the possibility, the tradition that kavana mamon. Mishum diyesh lomar shamdu Chazal al dat Torah. The rabbis must have come to understand what was the ultimate goal of the Torah. The Torah's ultimate goal is a goal of that its ways are ways of pleasantness. It's not possible. And it can't be that the Bible would command to do something that doesn't really achieve anything, because in the end you just have another person with his eye out, and it doesn't gain. What is the person who originally had his eye gouged out gained by having the other person's eye gouged out? He doesn't gain anything. You have two people with their eyes, as opposed to if he gets compensated, at least he's able to continue his life. He's able to get, pay off his medical bills. He gets something out of it. So again, the Torah Tamimi here is very radical in the sense that he's saying, the rabbis went and understood this must be what the Torah means, because since the Torah is derachei darchei noam, and you achieve nothing and solve nothing and help in no way the injured party, it must be that the Torah meant this and this and this rather than the alternative. Again, this is an example, and as I said, in the later generations, you find traditional rabbis willing to entertain that in their understanding of ayin tachat ayin. Okay, so this is the first example I wanted to look at tonight. The second example I wanted to look at tonight is agunot. Now remember, agunot, in its original context, a woman who is chained. An ogen means an anchor. in Hebrew. Ogen means an anchor. A woman who's chained to her husband in the rabbinic classic aguna refers to a woman whose husband goes out to sea and gets lost at sea or gets captured, and we don't hear from him again. And especially in antiquity, when there was no means of communication, and it might be that the person is still alive. He just can't communicate with us. So this creates a very difficult dilemma, because the woman is now potentially chained forever, since according to Jewish law, a woman cannot just get herself divorced on her own. A woman has to receive a divorce from her husband. Her husband might still be alive. And if he's still alive and she marries somebody else, then the children would be halachically mamzerim. They would halachically be in the status of a mamzer and not be allowed to marry into the rest of the Jewish people. And yet, what's interesting is, and it's a very serious problem, and yet, as one studies the laws of how the rabbis dealt with aguna, the classic aguna, right? Today, when we talk about the aguna, we don't talk about the classic aguna, even though there were very famous examples of the classic aguna in modern Jewish history. Two very famous examples, actually three very famous examples, was number one, after the Shoah, women whose husbands were taken away and they never heard from them again. Do we assume that they, how do we decide, what kind of evidence is allowed to say, they were killed, they were murdered in the concentration camps, and therefore the husbands can marry, the women can marry again and start a new life. During the Yom Kippur War, again, a lot of issues came up regarding agunot, and there was a specific number of issues that came up after 9/11 with some of the agunot. What kind of evidence of a person's death? The person was in the building, people saw him go into the building, but they never heard from him again. As opposed to, again, how much do you rely on? What kind of evidence do you rely? So again, those are three modern day examples of classical agunot situations that came before the rabbis. But we also today, of course, have the very tragic and infuriating kind of agunot of when we know exactly where the husband is. It's not like we don't know he died or he was consumed in a fire or in an earthquake. We know exactly where he's living, but he refuses to give a get. And that, of course, this is also yes. And of course, as Neva says, today we're, God forbid, we're going to have this problem with the missing in Israel after this war as well. So we're going to talk again about some of the classical agunot issues, but again, using the classical agunot issues, we are also going to go into, potentially, given the fact, the direction that the rabbis went, how do we apply it to today when we're dealing with the scoundrel type of husband, usually, sometimes it's the wife, but usually the husband, who unfortunately takes advantage of the halakha to keep his wife chained. So let's start with Maimonides. You can follow in the English. Rambam, in a very famous passage at the end of Hilchot Gerushin and the laws of divorce, says, a woman who we know was married, we assume she was married, and she and her husband went to a far-off place. V'shalom beino leveino, they were in good harmony. V'shalom ba'olam, uba v'amra meit ba'ali. And she comes and she says, my husband died on this trip, ne'emenet, v'tinaseo tityabe. We make an assumption. We assume a woman would not want to bring a problem on herself. We assume that she's not lying. We assume that she's not making it up, and that because this is something which is very easily discoverable. If she dumped the husband and left him on the island, at one point it's very easy to find out that he's still alive. He may come back, and then she will lose the ksuba that she took from the husband's estate as well as from the new man she married, and liot banei mamzerim, and she's not going to risk that her children will be mamzerim because they come out of a situation of eshet ish, of adultery. Notice Rambam doesn't assume, like the movies that we have today, that the wife would be in cahoots to murder her husband. We don't assume. That's something that's kind of beyond the pale of even imagination for the Rambam. We assume that, she, at most, she might have left him, but she would have killed him. Okay. And says, because we assume you can't, because you can't reject the fact that he would come. The halakha is very lenient. The halakha says, so too, if one aide comes, if one witness comes and testifies that her husband died, because if it's not true, we're going to find out. Even a slave, a woman, a maidservant, or a witness told another witness, what we call hearsay, even from relatives. So, and the woman is allowed to remarry based on that testimony, or she falls to be yavam, assuming that the husband is dead. She's now in levirate marriage. Now, this is an amazing halakha. The halakha says that we basically ignore the standards of evidence that we usually have in Jewish law. In Jewish law, you have to have two witnesses. In Jewish law, classical Jewish law, a woman is not believed. A woman is not kosher for edut, for testimony. An eved is not kosher for testimony. An aid mipi aid, one witness who told another witness, it's not acceptable evidence in halakha. And yet all these rules are basically done away with when it comes to agunot, this kind of aguna. We rely on very low levels of evidence. We rely, and again, for Rambam, the main point is because since hadavar asui ligalot, since it potentially can be easily found out and it could be revealed what actually happened, so we make these adjustments and we allow it. Now, it's still radical. Okay, fine. So it could davar shavidi ligalot. It's going to be discovered, but still, you basically seem to be ignoring Jewish law. How can you do that? Let's continue. Go down, please. So the Gemara in Yevamot, Daf Pechet, basically gives the rationale, the classic rationale. Amar Rav Zera, mitoch chomer shichmart alea besofa, hikalt alea betchila. Because we're so stringent with her at the end, meaning that this woman, if it turns out that she was lying, and it turns out the husband is alive, she now is an eshet ish, and she now is very severe. Now halakha is very severe with her, and she loses out all the ketubah that she got from the first husband and now from the second husband, and her children are mamzerim, you're lenient with her at the beginning. So the Gemara asks, meaning, why do we get ourselves into this pickle? Why don't we just keep the normal standards of evidence? Why are we doing this? So the Gemara says, Mishum iguna ikilu be rabbana, because of a chained woman who could suffer the rest of her life, the rabbis were very lenient with her. And therefore, the rabbis decided to, so to speak, to be very lenient with her and relax the rules of evidence. Again, it's still, because of aguna, which sounds like, again, a moral consideration, because it is intolerable for us to leave a woman chained for the rest of her life, we're willing to accept evidence that normally we wouldn't accept. Now, if you look at the Rambam, if we continue looking down, the Rambam writes, he says, at the very end, or even a non-Jew, says Rambam, again, repeating this idea that only something that we could only find out based on testimony does the Torah have these very high standards of testimony. When he's testifying about a fact which is very easy to ascertain, this guy is dead, he's not dead. Etc. etc. Again, for Rambam, it's this notion, this technical notion that we are, since it's easy to find out, we're not really even relying on the witness. It's almost as if it's easy to find out what the truth is, irrelevant of the testimony, and so we're very lenient. Now, if you continue, you'll see that not everybody went in the direction of the Rambam. Others were very troubled, not troubled, but it wasn't enough. Okay, so the Rambam says, because it's easy to determine, and since it's easy to find out, no one is going to lie, and we assume that in 99% of the time there's not going to be sheker, still you're manipulating the system. How can you get rid of the laws of Eidus? So there's two other approaches as follows. There's two other approaches. One approach is Rashi, which has a very striking statement also. On this, Rashi says in Shabbat Afkuf Memhei that we trust one witness, Edut Isha, Lomar Isha Meit Ba'alech, to say to a woman, your husband is dead. The rabbis were makil, they were lenient because of not wanting to leave a woman chained. V'chol de mikadesh adaita de rabbanan mikadesh, v'afki'inu rabbanan l'kiddush eminei. And now Rashi throws in the rationale. And since every halachic marriage was done based upon the fact that it should be accepted by the rabbis, in such a case, the rabbis said, if you can bring me even a little bit of evidence that the man is dead, we will retroactively annul the marriage. Afki'inu rabbanan l'kiddush eminei. So according to Rashi says, because of aguna concerns, it's not that the rabbis got rid of the laws of Eidus. The rabbis can't get rid of the laws of Eidus. They don't have such power. And even if it's something that is easily going to find out, the Rambam is a big chiddush. What do you mean? No. Because of aguna, if we just have even a scrap of evidence that this man died, we are going to use the power invested in us by Halakha, because every time a Jewish marriage occurs, what happens under the chuppah? You say, Harei at mikudeshet li b'tabadzo kidat Moshe v'Yisrael, according to the laws of Moses and Israel, which the rabbis in the Gemara and Gittin and many other places interpret to mean that every marriage is, so to speak, on some level, conditional. Every marriage is accepted that it so to speak, it passed muster with the rabbis of the time. And so if the rabbis feel that there's a terrible avla that's going to happen to this woman, there's a terrible injustice that's going to happen to this woman, they will take out the doomsday weapon of afki'inu l'rabbanan l'kiddushinei. They will annul the marriage retroactively, if they even have a scrap of evidence that this guy is dead, so that it turns out that she was never married to this guy. And so if she was never married to this guy, we don't need a get because she was never married, and whatever sexual liaisons they had are considered not marriage. And it turns out that whatever she does subsequently, she's not an Eshet Ish, she's not a married woman, and therefore we can treat her in this way. This is a very radical notion that Rashi introduces, and again, driven because of Aguna, because Mishum Aguna Ikilu Beram, because of Aguna, the rabbis are willing to bring out something that usually they don't do. If anybody studies Shas, they know that the rabbis in Shas, in the Talmud, use Afki'inu Rabbanan literally only 5 times. There's only like 5 or 6 actual cases where the rabbis annulled marriage. Rashi is saying that there is, so to speak, a 6th case. The whole concept of allowing an aguna based on very low levels of evidence to remarry is a sort of use of afki'inu. Now, this is very radical. And again, there were rabbis throughout history who wanted to use this as the solution to all aguna problems. However, the consensus amongst the halachis became very conservative, not to use afki'inhu beyond the times and the places where the rabbis actually used it. And so according to Rashi, they used it in a case where a husband disappeared. But when the husband's in front of us, we never find the rabbis using annulment, wholesale annulment. There are rabbis who would want to use annulment as a wholesale solution to aguna, or the threat of annulment. Let's put it that way. Given the fact that that the husband knows that potentially he has no power, that should be enough to deter him not to play games and to give the get right away. This has not been accepted as a mainstream solution to our aguna crisis. If you used it, and again, this was something that some rabbis at some point, like Rabbi Rachman and others, wanted to bring to the fore, but there was a lot of pushback because they felt that it would undermine the whole institution of marriage. If every time there was an aguna situation, you simply annulled the marriage, would that begin to, make a joke out of marriage, like you sometimes found in the Catholic Church, that if you were important enough in the Catholic Church, you could get an annulment. But if you weren't important enough and you weren't connected enough, you didn't get an annulment. So there was a tremendous pushback on that, and so it has not been accepted as a mainstream. A number of years ago, there was a big debate in tradition. Rabbi Riskin wrote an article which wanted to use a form of annulment in certain situations, and again, there was a counter argument against using it, even in the limited cases Rabbi Riskin wanted to use it. There is an even more radical solution, not more, but it's interesting, even more radical approach to this entire, and that's Tosfot in Yevamot. Tosfot in Yevamot says something radical. On commenting on the Gemara, which says, Mito chomer sheichmart alav besofa, because of the chumrah, that you were stringent on her at the end, which means that if it turns out that the husband is alive, she becomes an eshet ish, she becomes an adulteress, and her children are mamzerim, were makil at the beginning. Nira Lari says the Rimi Dampier in France, the great Ri Hagadol, the Letna Lamemer Anan Sahadi, the Deka Uminsva, V'neman Echad B'kach Minat Torah. Do not interpret it that we assume that what this means is that the woman, given the fact that, that things could really go awry for her and go downhill if it turns out that this is not the case of what this one witness is saying. Let lan lamemer, don't say, Anan Sahadi, we know, we can testify to Deka Uminsava, that she's very careful and she won't marry someone else. V'neman eid echad b'kach min haTorah. It makes no sense. How can an eid echad be believed? Ela mitakonas chachamim hu denema. Rather, it's not about the woman and her belief. It's rather a halachic statement. It's a halachic takana of Chazal. Ve'ein ze akirat davar min haTorah. Oh, you'll tell me, aren't the rabbis uprooting something in the Torah? No. Kevan shedome hadavar hagun laha'amin. Since it seems appropriate to believe what this guy says, it seems correct. There's no reason to doubt him. There's a technical halakha that says you have to, testimony is usually two, but it's not because we say that one witness is lying. It's just technically we believe you need two witnesses. But kevan shedome hadavar laha'amin, it seems that he's telling the truth. Shebidavar sheyesh ktsat tam usmach. When you're dealing with something where there is some tam, there is some legitimate reason to believe the one witness, lo chashiv oker davar min haTorah. It's not considered uprooting the law, which is exactly what you're doing. You're uprooting the law because it makes sense in this case. Because of Aguna, we're willing to give the rabbis the power to uproot the law when there's ktsat tam v'smach. It's a statement of Tosfot. And again, because of Aguna, Ikilu Barabanan is being read here by these Rishonim in a very radical light. Two more sources for tonight. I don't think we're going to get to mamzer. Rabbi Chaim Volozhin, the great student of the Gra, has a famous tshuva in Chut HaMeshulash, which is his Sheilotu Tshuvot, his responsa. And in that tshuva, he has a back and forth about a certain Aguna issue with a friend of his from when they were learning, when they were young. They were friends. And now Rabbi Chaim Volozhin wrote a tshuva being matir a certain Aguna, being lenient with a certain Aguna, and his friend critiqued him. And so Rabbi Chaim Volozhin writes back to him at the end of the tshuva, I see that regarding most things we are headed in the same direction. It is just that you incline towards stringency since the matter is not cast upon you. You have no responsibility. You're sitting in yeshiva, or you're sitting wherever you are, and for you it's a theoretical question. Just like you, I too did not turn to the allowances, the heterim, what we call heterim, the leniencies that emerged from study before the burden of decision-making was placed upon my shoulder. Now, however, as a result of our many sins, our environment has been orphaned of its sages. There's no more great chachamim, and the yoke of ruling for the entire area was placed on my shoulders. And I calculate with my maker and I saw it as a personal obligation to all my strength in order to persevere in finding a remedy for the agunot. The woman is standing before me. So it's not a theoretical question anymore. It's not a theoretical question anymore. I am going to look for every nook and cranny to be as lenient as possible, if I can, within the parameters of halakha. And let's finish tonight with an interesting citation from the Maharsha. The Maharsha is very famous commentary on the Tosafot. And the Maharsha here makes a fascinating, there's no English translation of it, so I'll just translate it. The Maharsha was a commentary on the Tosafot, written in the mid and late 1600s. And the Maharsha notes there are 4 times in the Shas where the Shas quotes the famous statement of the rabbis, Tamidei Chachamim Marbim Shalom Ba'olam. The rabbis add peace to the world. Somebody once said, how do you know that the Talmud has a sense of humor? Because it says, Tamidei Chachamim Marbim Shalom Ba'olam. That was one of the jokes I remember as a kid, people used to tell. Anyway, but the Talmud says that 4 or 5 times in Shas. So one of the places that it appears is Masechet Yevamot. And he says as follows. If you look, he says as follows. I'm picking up from this line. Venira, he's trying to explain why it appears at the end of Masechet Yevamot. Why did the rabbis choose to put this Agadata at the end of Masechet Yevamot? The Vadai, he says, Venira hatam dahacha behach memra. Why here did the rabbis cite this statement? Lefisheyesh v'Masechet zu dvarim tmuhim l'chora ki'ilu okrim davar min haTorah. Because there are things which are very strange in this Masechet, as if the rabbis kind of uprooted laws in the Torah. And in a few things, the rabbis say, Mishum Aguna, Hikilu Barabana. Ve'ein Zakira Davar Torah. Kevin Shadome Hadavar Hagun La'amin. The Tosot we just saw. Vehu Dachuk, Gam B'Shmaitzin. Hey Hikilu Be'eshet Ish. How were the rabbis so lenient with a married woman? La'kor Davar Min HaTorah. Davar Min HaTorah by Drisha V'Chakira, you require to investigate and question the witnesses carefully. And how do we do all these things? Etc., etc. Ve'ein ze ela divrei Kabbalah. The whole word, derachei darchenom. What does that mean? Ulazeh siyem b'masechet zu b'drash hazeh. That's why the Masechet ends with this drash. Tamidei chachamim marbim shalom v'lam. Shenem v'chol b'nei lumdei. Rotzelomar de'ein zo akira min haTorah. What the rabbis are trying to get out here from a philosophical point of view, that all of these leniencies in Aguna are not ultimately undermining or uprooting a law of the Torah. Dvarim elu nogiim b'midat shalom. They're driven by the quest for peace. So that so that we shouldn't get to a place where we have to do chalitza, where you have to do the ceremony of rejecting the woman, the man rejects the woman through the shoe, and yibum malevra, dezemevi ktata, because this could theoretically bring strife. The shema hu lo yachlotz, maybe he's not going to want to do it. V'hilo tachpotzbo, she doesn't want to marry him. V'tavoli de igun, v'ein zeh shalom. This doesn't bring, etc., etc., etc. Let me go down. Ve'amar Shalom Rab Lovei Tortecha De'ein ze akiral midat shalom Shalo te'agena isha Uchtiv derachea darchin hom. It says that the ways of the Torah ways of pleasantness. Shalo tim'as b'nei ha'ba'alav Himitain laget ein ze netivot shalom Ve'ein lamo michshol Shetavo leba'ala, etc. So it's driven by this kind of it's that God's ultimate ratzon, as he says here at the end, He says, "U'misayim Hashem oz la'amo yitain she'ein ze akirat davar min haTorah ki hakadosh baruch hu natan oz v'koach la'amo." God gave the power to the rabbis. She'ein tamid chacham b'davar zeh liot mikilim b'davar, to be lenient. Sharei Hashem yivarech et amo b'shalom v'chol tiyotei shalom ve'ein kan shalom im titagain. There's not real peace and harmony if a woman ends up not being able to marry. Ubederech hazeh yitparei shamikra yisa Hashem pelecha elecha gam la'akor davar min haTorah. God gives you the authority. So you're not simply uprooting something from the Torah. You're being driven by the desire for peace and harmony, which kind of colors your entire reading of the tradition. It's a very fascinating comment. And again, it shows you the power and the influence of the kind of moral moment in how you interpret, how you maneuver, how far you're willing to go in understanding and stretching the halakha. We're going to finish next week. We'll do a couple of more sources about agunot. We'll talk about mamzerut, and then we will get into the questions related to some very difficult moral issues in the Bible. We'll start with the Hanidachat. We'll start with the dark city, the city that has to be eradicated. And then the next session, we'll get to Amalekite and the destruction of the 7 nations in the land of Israel. And we'll talk about some war ethics as well. Okay, everybody, have a wonderful week.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Helfgot, and thank you everyone for being part of our learning community. Just a few announcements from Drisha before we go. Mishnah learning continues this fall with Mishnah in Depth, Masachet Yevamot, with Rabbi David Silber. This is every Saturday at 1 p.m. every Sunday, at 1 p.m. Eastern. Upcoming classes this week include Mamzer B'Chasid Echad on Wednesday mornings at 7:30 a.m. with Rabbi John Kelson. Work of the Heart, Reconnecting to Prayer at 2 p.m. on Wednesday with Miss Rachel Schultz. And Drisha's weekly Parsha class, Discussions on the Parsha at 12:30 p.m. on Thursday. This week with Rabbi John Kelson. We have more classes, and much more this fall's man that you can find and register for at 5784.drisha.org/fall. And with that, see you next week.